So the telephone rings inside. The butler left the porch, and Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned towards me. "I'll tell you a family secret," she whispered enthusiastically. "It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose?" "That's why I came over tonight." "Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning until night until finally it began to affect his nose." "Things went from bad to worse," suggested Miss Baker. "Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position." Apparently, this is a little cutesy story that she tells all the time because Miss Baker knows how it goes. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened, and then the glow faded, each light deserting her with a lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. Remember, the butler had answered the phone, so the phone must be for Tom. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose?" This was untrue. I'm not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing. But a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. And then, suddenly, she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, "Shh!" in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased together. "This Mr. Gadsby you spoke of is my neighbor," I said. "Don't talk. I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. "You mean to say you don't know?" said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. "I thought everyone knew." "I don't." "Why," she said hesitantly, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman?" I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. "She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think?" "Oh, so Tom has a little side piece who's calling him at her house. Do you think Daisy knows? Is that why she got up from the table?" Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "It couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker, and then at me, and continued. "I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over from the Cunard or the White Star Line. He's singing away." Her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, If it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside again, startlingly. "Ring!" And as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact, all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes of the table, I remember the candles being lit again pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone, and yet avoid all their eyes. So he wanted to look in their eyes and see what they were thinking, but he didn't want them to look at him. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hard skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guess shrill metallic urgency out of mine. Ring! The telephone, the fifth guest, the mistress. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while, trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Okay, so now Daisy and her cousin Nick get a chance to talk. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly. "Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding." I wasn't back from the war." "That's true." She hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything." Well, we know one thing that she should be cynical about, right? Her marriage? Evidently. Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. I suppose she talks and eats and everything." "Oh, yes." She looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much." "It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl, and she told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and I wept. 'All right,' I said, 'I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool.'" Which tells us something about how Daisy feels. She feels like a fool. She's a beautiful fool married to a rich guy that's cheating on her. "You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know. I've been everywhere, and I've seen everything, and done everything." Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way rather like Tom's, and she laughed with a thrilling scorn. "Sophisticated! God, I'm sophisticated." The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had just said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to extract a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment, she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Okay, so now they go back inside. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous, uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. "10 o'clock," she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. "Time for this good girl to go to bed." "Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow," explained Daisy, "over at Westchester." "Oh, you're Jordan Baker." Jordan, apparently, is a famous female golfer who's golfing over at Westchester. I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotograph pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I had heard some story of her, too, a critical, unpleasant story, but what it was I had forgotten long ago. "Good night," she said softly. "Wake me at 8, won't you?" "If you'll get up." "Oh, I will. Good night, Mr. Caraway. See you anon." "Of course you will," confirmed Daisy. "In fact, I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of, fling you together, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing." "Good night," called Miss Baker from the stairs. "I haven't heard a thing." "She's a nice girl," said Tom after a moment. "They ought not let her run around the country this way." "Who ought not to?" inquired Daisy coldly. "Her family." "Her family is one aunt, about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here over the summer. I think the home influence will be good for her." Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white. So we find out that Daisy was raised as a little rich white girl in Louisville, Kentucky. Did you give Nick a little heart to heart on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Ha! Yes, I'm sure we did. It sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know. So you notice the way she's actually making fun of her husband? This racist Nordic race comment he made. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, he advised me. I said lightly that I heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. And as I started my motor, Daisily peremptorily called, Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard that you were engaged to a girl out west. That's right, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard that you were engaged. It's a libel. I'm too poor. But we heard it, insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Of course, I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors. And on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. So we get some indication of what Nick ran away from in the West. Okay. Apparently, he was hanging with an old friend, a woman, and everybody started saying that he was going to get married. And so he ran away to the East because he didn't want to be rumored into marriage. So he was hanging with somebody. So did he have a girlfriend? Was she a girlfriend or not? Anyway, their interest rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms. But apparently, there were no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than he had been depressed by a book. Something was making him nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. So he's questioning why Tom is acting like this. Tom used to be the superstar football player back in school, and maybe he's searching for something else to be important about. So Nick leaves the party, leaves dinner, and drives home. Already, it was deep summer on roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. You remember he lives in the part of town that's along the water, West Egg. It's not the richest part of town because the richer part is East Egg, where he just came from. That's where Tom and Daisy live. But he drove over to his part of town. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gadsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. So here he is. He goes home after this dinner party and he sees Gadsby standing on his lawn. I decided to call out to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms towards the dark water in a curious way, and as far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. And when I looked once more for Gadsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. So apparently, Gatsby's standing on the lawn and Nick wants to talk to him, but Gatsby's got his arms stretched out, and his arms look like they were shaking, trembling, and they're all stretched out towards a single green lock light at the end of a dock. And when Nick looks back, boom, Gatsby's gone. So he doesn't actually say hello to Gatsby yet. So that's it for today.